In this video, I'm going to be building the best value, pure performance RTX 4070 Super gaming PC that you can assemble right now. This build is going to be amazing for 1440p gaming and one you can assemble for under $1,200 in the US and pick up for around £1,100 in the UK. Let's do this. As always, I'm going to talk you guys through all the parts in this build, show you how to put it together step by step, and look at performance in all the latest single and multiplayer titles a little bit later on. Now, if you want to buy any of the parts for this system, I'll leave them linked individually below, and you can also buy this build pre-built here in the UK from AWD for around £1,100, but more on that later. Now, NVIDIA kindly sent out the 4070 Super and helped make this build possible, but to tell you the truth, I've actually wanted to assemble a bang-for-your-buck 4070 Super build for a little while. And here's why. Now, this card comes with 12 gigabytes of video memory. That's good not only for 1080p, but also for 1440p gaming. Features like DLSS are genuinely very useful, especially at the mid-range. Things like frame generation in titles that aren't necessarily competitive FPS games, but RPG titles, something like Cyberpunk, really help to push those frame rates forward. And I also absolutely acknowledge that in some titles, the inclusion of ray tracing can be a massive value add too. The 4070 Super is like a midlife refresh and brings more performance over the original 4070, and this card reviewed really well when we first looked at it a couple of months ago. You guys will also notice I've picked up this ASUS dual variant. I like this card because it's one of the more affordable MSRP 4070 Super variants, and in our testing, given how power efficient the Ada Lovelace architecture is, you don't need a particularly large cooler to keep this GPU nice and chilly anyway. When it comes to maximizing the price to performance metrics in this build, that's where the other components come in. I want parts that are going to minimize bottlenecking with the 4070 Super, but also save cash and stick in budget. And that is where AMD's Ryzen 7 5700X comes in. Now, this is, yes, a last generation CPU, and with new chips on the horizon, this might feel like a weird choice. But hear me out. It's got 8 cores, 16 threads, and a boost clock speed that isn't that far away from that crucial 5 GHz figure. Plus, the ability to use older and cheaper B550 motherboards and DDR4 memory, which provide comparative performance, makes it a great value add. The 5700X supports boards like this B550M DS3H, and while yes, the upgrade paths aren't quite as good on the CPU side, if you want to maximize value for money now, this is a pure performance PC build guide, this makes total sense. This cost around the £100 mark, which is extraordinary value for money, and the CPU wasn't much more. Plus, when you compare the chip to something like a Ryzen 5 7600, a CPU that's going to cost you about 20 or 30% more, this still offers up more performance. You get all the things we need for this build, enough bandwidth for the graphics card, support for dual channel memory, and of course support for the Ryzen 7 5700X. The only thing you do need to be careful of is that the pins on these older Ryzen chips are actually on the CPUs themselves. So that makes the installation process a little bit more delicate, shall we say. ARM is going to lift up, and the box fresh 5700X is going to drop in. Nice and careful, pop the ARM down, super duper simple. As far as coolers go, I've picked up this Tower air cooler. To be honest, any Tower air cooler is going to be fine, whether that be Cooler Master's 212 lineup. Be Quiet have got a nice range of entry-level Tower air coolers too. This is the Vetroo V5, which I know you guys seem to particularly love, and I have been pretty impressed with in our testing. Now, as far as installation goes, let's see, shall we, what is going on. It's then just a simple case of removing these pre-installed screws for the bracket, before adding on the AMD brackets to the bottom of the CPU cooler and securing the screws back into place. And once that's done, a little bit of thermal paste onto the CPU is going to get the whole thermal bond moving in the right direction. And of course, our Vetroo V5 is just going to fasten nicely on top. Oh yeah. I'm also going to go ahead and pop the RAM or memory in at this point. If you're going to buy a system like this pre-built, such as through the link in the description below, this is one of the things I would definitely upgrade. For me, 32 gigabytes right now is the minimum as to where you should be, and that's why I've gone for two 16 gig DIMMs in this build today. This is 3600 megahertz with a low latency too, and I've never opened it before. Yeah. And to reap the benefits of the dual channel performance, you're going to be using the grey slots if you're replicating this build for yourself. That's going to ensure you get all the extra bandwidth that we need in this build and give us the advantage of 2 DIMMs. If you install them in different slots, the dual channel functionality isn't necessarily going to work. While I'm here, I'll also be popping the M.2 SSD in. I've gone for the Crucial P3+, but in truth, anything in this realm is going to be good. WD have got an SN770 drive, which I really like. We're talking top of Gen 3, entry-level Gen 4 is where you want to aim in a system like this. Capacity all comes down to your use cases and your needs. I've budgeted in this system for a 1TB drive, but save money by picking up a 500 gig, or obviously spend a bit more with a 2TB option. I've got the screwdriver in my hand. I don't need the screwdriver. This is a fully toolless installation. So as much as this is a slightly older board, the feature set is still really modern, which is good to see. And the drive slots in nice and easy. No PCI Gen 5, but you do get PCI Gen 4, which is more than good enough for a build like this. Once that's all said and done, it's time, I think, for the case. This is the Corsair 3000D, and it's available in a few different flavors. But one of the reasons I actually picked this up is it's very commonly bundled on sales and deals with this, the Corsair RM750E. So these two go like peas in a pod. They match perfectly. And I actually really like what Corsair have done with the 3000D. Now this is basically a smaller and cheaper 4000D, and it comes in an RGB derivative with RGB fans and a non-RGB derivative without RGB fans. I'm going to pop some RGB fans in this a bit later in today's video, so just the one exhaust fan in there for now. One thing to note about this build is that I have gone for a standard form factor ATX case and a smaller micro ATX motherboard. In an ideal world, you'd match the form factors of both. The reality just is that when the motherboard goes in, as you can sort of see, there's going to be a little bit of dead space at the bottom. This case is fairly compact, so that's not too bad. And of course, the motherboard saves us money. So for me today, it's a compromise I can live with when it comes to maximizing performance. It's a pure performance build. Hopefully, as little cash wasted as possible. The only thing that might feel a bit strange is remembering to pop the I/O shield in. This is built in on most modern motherboards, and again, it's all about that cost-saving measure. Audio ports click in down here towards the bottom. I've already moved the standoffs into the right locations, but just for the record, there should be 3 at the top, 3 along the middle, and then 2 down here towards the bottom. Then it's a simple case of sliding the board in. You'll notice I've not yet put the fan back on the air cooler, and that's just because the whole thing's a bit easier with the fan off. There we go. So the center standoff is actually raised, so that will hold the board into place, and the box of included screws is what I'll be using to fasten the motherboard down. You can see here, there is a bit of extra wasted space, but I don't think it looks too bad. With all that said and done, it's time for the GPU, and as you can see, I'm already taking it out the box. I'm so impatient. This ASUS dual card, I think, should be a really, really great fit for the build today. And again, have I not used this before? I swear I've used this GPU before. Anyway, you have to like lift these side pieces up, and then the graphics card slides out. It's a bit weird, I'll be honest, ASUS. It's not a criticism, it's just an observation. Size-wise, this thing should be pretty perfect for the build today. Yeah, look at that. In terms of PCI slots, it looks to me like it's the top 2, or maybe the second and third, actually. Yes, the second and third slots. So again, that's pretty good. On some ATX boards, the GPU goes in the very first PCI slot, and that can make the build feel a little bit cramped. So actually, this is working out really quite nicely. Make sure the retention clip is pushed back, and then it's a simple case of sliding the GPU into place. Bit of pressure, get that to click in, and then the thumb screws are going to secure the card into the slots and stop it from going anywhere. This actually fits in the build really nicely, and the stealthy black theme of the system is really starting to come together. All that then remains after that is the power supply and all the cables and wiring. So let me briefly walk you through exactly how you're going to do this if you'd like to follow along for yourself. Now, power cables that are required include the very large motherboard power connection, potentially a SATA power cable for any RGB connections or any fan hubs or fan controllers, a single 4+4 pin CPU power connector, and then of course the PCI cable too. Now this isn't ATX3, it doesn't use the new ATX3 standard, which is why it's not advertised as such, but great to see brownie points for Corsair here for including this cable. That helps this build look that bit more sleek. I'm obviously going to go for a fan down orientation today to pull in fresh air from underneath the case, but the ventilation on top means either is technically fine. Motherboard power cable is going to go to the right hand side, GPU of course to the graphics card, and CPU up to the top left corner. All that remains then is the front panel cables and of course popping the CPU cooler fan back on. For front panel there is the HD audio down to the bottom left, USB 3 to the right hand side of the motherboard, and all the fiddly front panel cables to the bottom right too. And all that remains then is to see if this thing actually boots up and some of the performance that hopefully we can achieve. A few RGB fans added in later, and it's time to boot this system up. Now, the first thing that I want to do is head into the BIOS to make sure that XMP is enabled for the memory. I'm going to do this by hitting delete repeatedly on the keyboard. Fans are spinning. We've got the splash screen. Hopefully, we will land into the BIOS. Now, you can see all's looking pretty good. No temperatures seem particularly out of control. We've got our two 16 gigs of RAM and our Ryzen 7 5700X 8-core CPU. You want to make sure that XMP is set to profile 1, and it should pick up from the memory automatically the overclocking profile. So that takes me up to 3600. Hit F10 to save and exit. It will show you the changes you've made. And I've gone ahead and pre-installed Windows on this drive already and added in all the game drives I'll be using for benchmarking. So fingers crossed, it should all just work. The next job once I'm into Windows is to get all the RGB working. Now for this, I'm going to use an app called Signal, which is one of my favorite applications out right now. And it's basically like a universal RGB control that works with pretty much everything. Now you can see you get all these different like various presets that you can choose from, whether it be like a pure rainbow mode, which hopefully, there we go, looking good. So that's like a system-wide rainbow effect. This space preset I always think is pretty cool. It as a piece of software does a great job of tying everything together. Maybe for this video we'll go for a solid blue, and I'm happy that's all looking pretty good. Now I also want to make sure I've got GPU drivers in. Now for this, I'll be using the brand new NVIDIA App. Now the NVIDIA App's really good because it replaces essentially GeForce Experience. It's still technically in beta, but it ties all your features together in one. Everything from the drivers, which look to be, up to date. You can access the app from any place on your computer using Alt-Z, and I'm also going to use this to record the screen, which is great for capturing gameplay and for things like benchmarking, like I'm doing today. My favorite thing about this though is that you haven't got to log in, which brings me great joy. You can just do all of it instantly without too many problems. From the homepage, you can then see all your library of games, and you can adjust the settings in those games too. That makes life so much easier and basically uses the data of everybody else's gaming settings to determine what's best. So I've set Horizon to the recommended settings, but you can tune further up for quality, or you can tune further down for performance, aka more frame rate. I'm going to jump into those gaming benchmarks in just a moment. Before that though, I do want to point out, of course, if you are in the UK and you'd like to buy this system, I'll link it down below. This AWD site has a really nice configurator, so you can notch the memory up. That's what I did. I think it's important really to have at least 32 gigs right now. And if you're over in the US, I'll link all the various options below for different retailers too. Now performance though is the important bit. This is meant to be a great value 4070 super system. What kind of frame rates can we achieve? The first game on my benchmark list is Horizon Forbidden West, but you can skip through all the various benchmarks using the timestamps below. Now, as far as settings go, I am using a 4K monitor, but this is very much a 1440p build. So let's tune the resolution down to 2560 by 1440. I'm going to turn off DLSS for now to give us the straight rasterization figure, disable frame generation as well, but enable NVIDIA Reflex to obviously help trim the latency down and keep things nice and snappy. If you want the full graphics settings, by the way, here they are, everything tuned up to very high, 16 times on the texture filter as well, to really push things to the max. First impressions are pretty good, sitting at around about 90 frames per second, though admittedly not a great deal going on right now. This game looks amazing on this panel, by the way, and you can see you got 1% low of around about 60 FPS, so staying crucially above all the important numbers. Now, I am interested to see what happens if I enable a bit of DLSS and what impact this is going to have on the frame rate. So I'm going to set this to DLSS on the quality preset. That's going to make sure that the upscaler is not too heavy on the game, but leave frame generation off for now. Straight away, that's put things above 100 frames per second, actually 110 FPS, which is really not too bad. And as you can see visually, the game I think still looks really good. The next natural step then, I suppose, is to turn on frame generation. So let's go through into display, graphics settings are all identical, upscale quality, DLSS frame gen on, hit apply, keep the changes. And as you can see, this has made a difference already, up now to over 140 FPS at times, 150 to frame gen helping us move from 100 frames per second or so right into the 150 territory, which I am not complaining about at all. Next on the list is Alan Wake 2, obviously one of the more harder to run titles right now, so interesting to see at 1440p with no DLSS enabled, no ray tracing and high across the board how the game performs. So let's see where we're at. So looks visually pretty good at 1440p, 67 FPS, so not a huge amount of frame rate to play with in terms of things like turning ray tracing on, but smooth, and for an RPG game, it's not exactly a competitive first-person shooter, this is going to be sufficient. Now, if I go into the settings, I think you guys know what's coming next. Go down to graphics, turn on DLSS, and set the render resolution to, again, let's use the quality preset, and keep frame generation off for now. See what that's going to do. So that's boosted up straight away to nearly 100. Wow, that's actually a way bigger impact than I thought of the quality preset. As far as the visual fidelity goes, not a great deal of difference between the original full res image and DLSS on quality. Go down to balanced or performance, and you're going to see more drop off. Now, if I go back into graphics and turn on frame generation, that should obviously make a massive difference again. I'd rather enable frame gen than make the DLSS setting more aggressive because the visual fidelity impact is lower, basically. 130 FPS, pretty good. So you can see we've gone from struggling really to maintain anything much more than 60 to well over double that at about 140, 130. Other option as well, of course, you might want to do is enable a bit of ray tracing. You can see here, ray tracing, we can put that on, let's say high, enable ray reconstruction as well, and go back into the game. Now, ray tracing is on high, so you can see the frame rate impact is there. We're down to about 90, still far higher than where we started. And of course, you can see, especially in the reflections on the ground, even the mist in the air, how much better the game looks. I actually think with ray tracing on, providing the performance difference isn't massive, and this is okay, it's definitely worth adding. Frame generation, if we just turn that off to demonstrate how much of the heavy lifting frame gen is doing, you can see straight away, ouch, down to below that 60 mark, and this feels considerably less smooth. So frame gen definitely on, ray tracing on if you want the visual fidelity upside. The next game on my benchmark list is of course a bit of Call of Duty Warzone. Now you can see here running at 1440p, all the quality settings are set to high, no ray tracing, no DLSS, so straight rasterization here to kick things off. The only thing I have got enabled at this point is NVIDIA Reflex. That's going to help minimize the latency represented by the PCL figure up here, currently at about 44 milliseconds. Frame rate wise, sitting at a pretty solid 115 FPS give or take. Quite happy with that. Though I would be interested to see what happens if I jump into the settings menu, go down into graphics, quality, and then enable DLSS. I can do that via upscaling, NVIDIA DLSS, and hit apply. The main thing I'm worried about is an increase in latency. That actually is pushing the latency actually not anywhere at all. Still at about 44 milliseconds, 38 milliseconds on the latency via NVIDIA Reflex. So pretty pleased all in all with that number. Frame rate is still sitting strong at about 123 FPS. When I turned on DLSS, I'm pretty sure I used the quality preset. Yes, quality. Obviously, if you wanted to push the settings even further, you could go all the way down to balance. That's going to give you a little bit more frame rate at the expense of a bit more visual fidelity. Still sitting strong, 131 frames per second. Pretty happy with, where are we going? What's this going on? And performance all around feels pretty good. It looks like it's all over. We lasted well. Performance was pretty good. Quite a long range kill, to be fair. And frame rates, once again, at 1440p on this system. Really not too bad. Next on the list of titles to test is Ghost of Tsushima. Again, this is going to allow us to push the 4070 Super hopefully nice and far and see what the overall build is able to offer. Now, in terms of the window mode, exclusive full screen, 1440p, I'm going to disable DLSS, to be honest, to begin with. Keep anti-aliasing on DLAA and make sure reflex is on, frame gen is off, resolution scaling is off, and VSync off. Good. Lots of settings to play with. Again, let's test out that rasterization figure first and see where the game lands. Okay, so we are in 74 FPS is not too bad, and graphically, oh my goodness, on this OLED monitor, this game looks incredible. Now, obviously the frame rate, we're going to try and push it a bit further into the graphics menu. Everything you can see is already on high and ultra as it stands. But if I jump into display and turn the upscale method to DLSS, hopefully that's going to move us from that 70, 80 FPS mark to, yes, look at that, more towards the 100 FPS barrier. And you can see graphically, still looks absolutely sensational. Push things a little bit further again, we can go and turn on frame generation. So we can, of course, add DLSS frame gen into the picture. And look at that, now well over that 100 mark, right up to about 140. So we're pretty much double the frame rate that we started off with. And oh my goodness, on an OLED monitor, this game is like nothing else. I have to say, pretty impressed with this title and the performance of this machine. I was kind of worried about seeing like CPU bottlenecking. And while CPU usage is maybe marginally higher than what you might see on a Ryzen 7000 or Intel 14th gen, we're still seeing a GPU bottleneck, for want of a better word, which obviously shows the graphics card isn't being held back, and that's the main thing. I've also gone ahead and tested a range of FPS titles on this system, starting off with Apex Legends. At 1440p high in this competitive FPS title, the build performed really well, smashing through the 200 FPS mark and delivering 235 frames per second on average. Cyberpunk 2077 was a similarly positive story, 1440p high, and the build achieved not quite 100 FPS, but 94, which is good enough for me, is a difficult game to run. I'll take 94 frames on average. While Fortnite finally wraps things up, again at 1440p high, with a really strong average of 173 FPS. Of course, if you opted to tune things down to 1080p competitive, you'd get even higher on that frame rate, but 1440p is where I did all the testing for today's build. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to get subscribed, drop a comment, let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.